The vaccine crisis has been very much with us, certainly since various types of vaccine have come out a few months ago, and it's dividing people onto those who are pro-vaccines, either 1, 2, and booster vaccines, and those who are anti-vaccines. A great play within the Greek tradition called Antigone, Sophocles. There are 3 great tragic writers. The greatest of them is Aeschylus, and then Sophocles would be the second, and the third of a lesser note is Euripides. But in Sophocles' play Antigone, the story goes somewhat like this. One of the great city-states was defending itself against attacks, and 2 brothers were in conflict. Both sought that they, in fact, should be the rulers of the city-state. One defended the city-state in terms of what he thought was the proper way of understanding how the city-state should be run. The other brother felt that he was betraying the heritage that he had been given. So the story begins in sibling rivalry. First of all, parents, sibling, and as any great myth, remember, myth is not a falsehood, it's an eternal truth wrapped in the garment of a story. As the war went on, the one brother won, the one who was seen as defending the state. The other brother lost. The sister of the brother who lost, Antigone, felt that her brother, even though she differed with him, was still her brother, and he deserved a good state funeral. He should be protected, and even though within families one can have their differences, at the end of the day, Antigone argued that her brother, even though a traitor to the state, should be given a proper funeral. Now, her uncle Creon represents the state, and he argued, your brother betrayed the state, he undermined law, he undermined order, and there is no way he should be given a proper state funeral. Creon embodies, in that sense, the role of the state, its role of the common good, of security, of that which is right and good for citizens, protecting the state. And of course, remember, this situation, they just come out of chaos, war, destructions, families turning on one another. The other element is Antigone arguing that, in fact, the state has its role and has its right, but there's limitations of what the state can command and how far a citizen should obey the state. COVID crisis. In the COVID situation, what we have is Creon very much arguing in the midst of chaos. We have COVID. We have the implications of COVID, people in hospitals, people dying, the numbers who are infected who don't die, but there's no doubt COVID is a reality. The state has acted Creon-like, saying vaccines are important to prevent further deaths or chaos or confusion. Double vaccines, passports. This is the state, this is Creon stepping in. Now, on the other hand, there are the Antigones who are going to argue the state's reach should be limited, and there comes a point when you have to say no to the state in the name of individual rights or individual goods. So here you have a clash between group rights embodied by the state and individual rights embodied by Antigone and those in certainly the vaccine crisis who argue the state cannot command them to have vaccines. Now, what happens in the clash between Antigone and Creon is that both get frozen into their own position. Both think they're absolutely right and the other is absolutely wrong. The position of the state under Creon takes the position that those who dare to disobey it have to face the consequences for doing so. Those who are from the position of individual rights, Antigone argues that the state does not have absolute rights to tell individual citizens what they should do. This is a perennial tension. Obviously, it's as old as history. It can occur in families, it can occur in relationships. Back of it, of course, is not just the state individual. Underneath it is an epistemology or a hermeneutic in that sense, in which both groups think they're absolutely right and both tend to caricature the other position. Now, what Sophocles is doing in Antigone, he's making it clear where you get people frozen or embalmed in positions and they see the other wrong and their own right, and they congratulate themselves on their own rightness, and the other is irrational, it's superstitious. What in fact is happening, it happens, and this is why this is called a tragedy, is where does this lead? And Sophocles astutely aware that when you have two people or two positions or two groups, state and individual, group rights individual, both claiming the content of their position, i.e. the vaccine issue in this case, cannot be questioned, and both sides collide on that, and they don't listen to the other side, you inevitably get a collision. In this case, what happens is because Creon is the head of the state, he essentially says, Antigone, by burying your brother, we're not going to, Antigone absolutely refused to allow her brother to be left in the open field where vultures would pick his skin. She wanted to give her brother a fair burial. Creon said there is no way. He has betrayed the order, the security, the predictability of what the state offers for the common good. She took her brother and disobeyed the state, and Creon then stepped in and said, well, you want to do that, there's also implications for you as individual who want to determine what the state should do and violate and disobey the state. So he basically says, your life is essentially at an end. He, funeral, as it were, cave is prepared for her. The stone is rolled across. He's given her a bit of food for a few days. Now, back of this, Antigone was supposed to marry Creon's son. And so when Creon's son becomes aware what her father has done to Antigone, he comes to his father and says, what have you done? This polarization between you, Creon, and Antigone, this is going to lead to a tragedy. Please, let's go back to this rock tomb and save Antigone from a terrible death. Creon begins to relent, seeing the error of his extremist absolutist ways. Remember, Antigone and Creon are both absolutist in their interpretation. They finally get to the tomb, roll the rock back. Antigone has committed suicide, hung herself, thinking she's going to die, so better do it quick rather than a slow death. Antigone's fiance then goes back to Creon. He commits suicide, and Creon and his wife, then things deteriorate very quickly. What Sophocles is doing in this, and which really it has a perennial relevance for the vaccine issue, is what happens when the state and individuals differ on how to interpret an issue, which is a controversial one, the vaccine crisis being one of many. This just happens to be our most prevalent and obvious the last few months. And what happens when neither side listens to one another? What Sophocles is arguing in his great play Antigone is that we have people who freeze in positions, absolutizing their own interpretation and demonizing, caricaturing undermining the other, is that you're set up for a tragedy. And so Sophocles, in portraying this so graphically and rawly in terms of the implications of taking such a position, it's like a warning, be careful. Either side of absolutizing your own view. A little intellectual humility is in order, but rather than often what happens in the vaccine crisis, we're seeing a polarization, a freezing in one's own position, and then a caricaturing the other. Where does that lead? Well, Sophocles made it very clear it leads to tragedy. And is there other ways of dealing with situations other than two groups caricaturing the other, absolutizing their own position, and not being willing to hear or learn from one another? If a certain path is taken, Antigone via Sophocles makes it clear this will lead to a tragedy. Is that where you want to go? If not, what are other options on the journey? But Antigone is a graphic portrayal of one of the great works of Greek tragedy, of people who don't listen to one another, who take positions at odds with one another, and are unwilling to learn from one another in a very, very difficult, contentious issue.